and turn it over to Ahmed, who is the manager of culinary programs for Collier County. So welcome, Ahmed.
Thank you for that wonderful lead-in and introduction. It's much appreciated. As was just mentioned, I am the culinary program manager for the Culinary Accelerator in Immokalee. And I know that's a lot of words, and it's kind of interesting, you know, how we came to deciding to name it that. But basically, it's a shared commercial kitchen commissary workspace where upstart food entrepreneurs in the culinary world come to launch their business. And through this presentation, I'm going to kind of go into the different types of permitted facilities and regulators and regulations that we kind of deal with on a day-to-day basis in our facility, how that might apply to you if you're looking to start a food business, or if you're looking to start a commissary or shared commercial kitchen yourself. Throughout today's, presentation, if you have questions, please put them in the chat. We do cover a lot of ground, being a shared facility, as we have all kinds of different food products that are being launched from here. So, most likely we have experienced what you're going through, what you might be going through in the future if you're looking to launch a food business. So my first slide is potential challenges. Obviously, it's starting, any food business, any business at all is difficult, but especially in the food facility, food business world, there's so many more challenges than just starting just a normal or regular, marketing company or things like that. Not that those are challenging themselves, but some of the things you want to look at are initial funding, the market research for your product. The commercial kitchen aspect, which is what I specialize in, is probably, the more difficult part and what most people struggle with finding in the beginning. There's a lot of money that goes into designing, building, buying all the equipment, making sure the plumbing is correct, which I'll go into later on in my presentation. The food safety regulations, which are ever changing. And depending on what kind of food you're selling, whom you're selling it to, how you're selling it, how you're packaging it, can change completely which regulation you fall under and what's required of you. And then your food permitting, knowing what you're allowed to do under the food permit that you're going after. For example, if you want to be a caterer and you want to do, quick service food and, sell directly to the public, getting the proper permit that's going to allow you to do that versus selling packaged frozen food is a whole nother agency and a whole nother permit that you're going to have to get, which I'll go into a little bit later. Having a marketing plan and a business plan, a lot of people kind of put the cart before the horse, and they have a great product, they have a great recipe that maybe was passed down from generations, but having that business plan, the marketing plan, that side set up is paramount as having great food products. So knowing that and the financial stability and viability of your product, is it something that the market's ready for, that you're going to be able to sell enough of it in order to sustain your business? What's going to be the size and scope of your business and your market and who you're going to sell to? So all these are kind of potential challenges that you're going to want to understand before you get launched and start going after getting a commercial kitchen set up. So setting up your business. So kind of like with the last slide, forming your LLC, making sure that you're registered in Florida. You have, SunBiz is a great tool for you to use. You go to that website, you can set up your business, you can see which names are taken, which are available, registering with the Florida Department of Revenue, your local county and city business tax receipt, knowing what you're going to need to go do that and get set up. A lot of people will end up going to your county tax office to try to get your business license, but not realizing that you have to have your food permit first before you can even get that is required. So food safety training, there's different levels of food safety training depending on what kind of food business you're going to do. Let's say a food truck and getting your serve safe training and food safety training, that's going to be kind of like your basic starting point. But if you're going to operate, let's say, an acidified food, hot sauce company, there's even more training with HACCP and different plans and training that you have to get before you can even launch your business. So understanding, depending on what your food is, who you're going to sell it, how you're packaging. And you're going to hear me say that a lot today, because one change in how or you're packaging your food or how you're making it can put you in a completely different ballpark as far as what the regulations you're going to fall under and who's going to regulate you. So the major food permit agencies in Florida, we have FDACS, which is the Florida Department of Agriculture and Consumer Services. They handle a lot of your, manufacturing. They also do bakers. And I'll go into kind of more in later slides in depth on that. DBPR, which is Department of Business and Professional Regulations. They handle all of your restaurants, your basic food trucks, and things of that nature. USDA is kind of a little bit larger, which most people won't end up under USDA unless you're doing large scale beef and meat production, chicken as well. Understanding minimum construction standards, which Lisa did a great job talking about with DBPR. I'm going to go in kind of, it's very similar to DBPR and FDAX as far as the construction standards, but just talking about and understanding what a commercial kitchen, a licensed kitchen, kind of how it's different or differs from your home kitchen, and why, those differences are put in place. Having liability insurance and understanding, the liability aspect of running a commercial kitchen, and a process authority letter, depending on the type of your product, as I mentioned earlier. You may have to send a sample of your product off to an accredited lab to get it tested and just to make sure it's safe, to make sure it meets the parameters of whichever regulation you will fall under. So the regulatory agencies, as I mentioned a little bit, DBPR, Department of Business and Professional Regulation, the Florida Department of Agriculture and Consumer Services. I already talked about a little bit where you fall under those. The Department of Health, that's generally for your schools, your hospital, kind of like your institution, colleges, things like that. So unless you're going to operate in a facility like that, you really won't have to deal with the Department of Health. And those of us that are from up north or from other states, Department of Health is generally who deals with your food inspections and your health inspections. In Florida, it's set up a little bit differently. So it can be confusing if you're coming from out of state here and you see 5 or 6 different agencies that you might fall under. Which is even more important in understanding what kind of food you're going to do and who you're looking to sell it to, because that'll change which agency you fall under. The USDA, which is federal, like I said, that's more of large scale meat and poultry production, and generally in a shared commercial kitchen environment. And I'll get into this a little bit more detail later, but USDA will not license generally in a shared commercial kitchen environment. They're more of you having your own entity. So it's a lot harder for upstart, starting kind of entrepreneurs to get started with that with USDA. And then the Food and Drug Administration, they put out the food code, which the most recent one was 2017 that we're operating out of in Florida. DBPR operates off of the Food and Drug Administration's food code. It's a 700-page document that gives local agencies kind of a legal foundation to enforce regulation and enforce the rules into different food agencies. So that's an overview of the food regulatory agencies that you'll see in Florida. Moving on to the next slide, the type of food establishments. So as I continue to mention, you'll hear me probably say it a bunch of times today because it's really important. Depending on what kind of food operation you want to do, it's going to completely change how you're planning and how you're going to go about getting your food license. So hotels and restaurants, those would fall under DBPR. So would catering companies. Bakers, however, fall under FDAX, and you get your license from them. So an example of that, Starbucks. A lot of Starbucks, you might think that as a restaurant, but it's actually, most of them are classified as a bakery or coffee and beverage company, and they're licensed by FDAX and not DBPR. So you could have a restaurant next to Starbucks, and they're in the same plaza and they're serving the same food, but they're licensed by 2 completely different companies, or 2 different completely agencies. Food trucks, same thing. If you're doing a food truck that does pastries and bakery or coffee and beverages, you're most likely going to be licensed by FDAX. If you're doing one that does barbecue, then you're more likely to be licensed under DBPR. Now there are, just like any rule, there are exceptions to the rule. And, I've heard the same company being licensed by 2 different agencies in different cities, depending on, what's already been established in the cities and the local regulatory agents, what, they've decided. So it's important to come up with your plan and what kind of food you're going to get started with early, and to speak, if you feel like you're on the fence or you're kind of on the border straddling whether you'll be a baker or you're going to actually have other food and sandwiches, I would reach out to both agencies and they will kind of give you direction on which one you'll go with. Produce markets, and those are licensed by FDAX. Same with grocery stores, they're licensed by FDAX. Food manufacturing, so if you're thinking large scale hot sauce production or salsa or barbecue sauce, you will fall under, generally, good rule of thumb is FDAX. Another good rule of thumb, if you're thinking of having a product that's going to be extended shelf life, let's say you're going to do a vacuum sealed, ready to eat meal prep, and you want it to be good for 14 days, or if it's going to be extended shelf life in the freezer. Most likely the cutoff for DBPR, which is like catering and restaurants, you're going to end at 7 days. If you're looking to have food that's going to be good for longer than 7 days, you're more likely going to end up under FDACS and needing a permit from them. So meat, poultry, seafood production, it all depends on the scale. So if you're doing a small poultry production, there are exemptions that will allow you to operate without USDA inspection. But if you're looking to do large scale meat, poultry, things like that, you're more than likely going to fall under the USDA. But like I said, there's exemptions in place for small businesses. Generally, it's around, if you're doing under $1 million in sales, or has to do if you're only doing in-state and not doing in different states and things like that. There are exemptions for you to get started small, and you could fall under the state agency of FDACS or DBPR and not have to apply for a USDA permit. So that's kind of a range. Obviously, there's different food businesses that could fall in between those. And it's just reach out to your agencies. That's really the biggest advice I can give anyone. Get a contact for who's going to be a local inspector once you put in your application. Generally, they'll reach out to you. And it's really a very close working relationship with your inspector, because they're the ones going to be enforcing the regulation and enforcing the standards set in whether it's the food code or local regulatory regulations. They're going to enforce it, so you're going to want to know what they're looking for. Minimum construction standards. Yes, I'm sorry if I'm going too fast. Slow me down.
No, you're doing great. I thinking about, right, when we reach out to these big agencies, there's a lot of people who work at these big agencies. And so I'm wondering, you mentioned reaching out to the local inspector. How will people find out who is the local inspector? Is there anybody at the state level that you have found to be particularly responsive and helpful? I know that with bureaucracy, sometimes it can be hard to find the right person to actually have a conversation with. So I'd love to hear your tips on how to actually communicate with the right person.
No, that's great. You're absolutely right, because the other thing I failed to mention, I'm glad you brought that up, is both of these agencies operate out of Tallahassee for the entire state. So think Orlando, Miami, I live in Naples, whether you're in Tampa, wherever, they're dealing with calls for anyone looking to start a food business from all of those states. So they're inundated. So it is important to have someone that you can contact. Obviously, Lisa for DBPR is a great contact, and she's very knowledgeable. She's been helpful for us, even at my facility, with questions. So definitely make sure you hold on to her information if you were on her earlier presentation. With FDACS, we know who our local regulator is. When you apply for your food permit with FDACS or DBPR, it goes through a vetting process through Tallahassee, and then it gets shot down to your local regulator. That regulator, that inspector, is going to reach out to you. So when they reach out to you, ask those questions, try to get their contact, whether it's an email or phone number. It's kind of hard to initiate that with them, but once you get your application approved and you're going through that process, as soon as they reach out to you, get their information, get their email, and it's only going to help them do their job easier, because they know that you're going to be asking the questions, what they can get done. Because the worst thing, they don't want to come out and fail your initial inspection and then have to keep coming back to fix things. So if you have questions about anything up front, as soon as they reach out to you, get their number, get their email, figure out how you can get in touch with them, and start that line of communication. Because the more open communication you have with your inspectors, trust me, your life is going to be a lot easier, so much easier. But it is unfortunate, you're going to have to start with going through Tallahassee, and then they'll assign someone and they'll reach out to you. But no, that was a great question. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Yep. Minimum construction standards. So, you look at your kitchen at home. Most kitchens at home have, electric, have a basic hood system that isn't even, exhaust to the outside. It's more of a filter system. When you're talking about building a commercial kitchen, it is a whole different animal. There's certain things, for example, the plumbing, you have to have what's called an air gap, where the plumbing from your sink doesn't get directly plumbed into the floor. It actually has a space of air where the water drops. And what that does is prevent backflow from dirty water coming up and mixing with clean water. So there's all these specific construction standards, which are listed on both FDACS and DBPR. And for anyone, I'll just say this up front, for anyone that wants these slides, they'll be available to send out to anyone that requests them. On the slide right here for FDACS, this is actual link to their construction standards, and DBPR, this is a link to their plan review guidelines, which both give you a pretty detailed instructions on how your construction's to go. So if you're doing a new construction build, This is something you're definitely going to want to go over with your general contractor. And most of them know, but you still want to know for yourself just to review anything that might be missed. And then if you're even if you're taking over an existing location that was a food facility before, you're going to want to review these construction standards, because what unfortunately happens is when a facility is initially licensed, they meet all these requirements. But if something breaks down, or if the owner decides to fix it themselves or does something that isn't within these construction standards, when you reapply for inspection, it's going to fall on you to get those things fixed. So it's important for you to know what is required in food facilities as far as hand sinks and how many hand sinks you need. Things that you might even think about, like lighting. The amount of lighting in an area is even detailed in these construction standards. The type of food processing equipment, they have to meet a certain standard, which if you're interested about knowing the food processing equipment standards, look up NSF, the NSF certified equipment. They're a national company that certifies food equipment as being safe for food production, toilet facilities, and having enough of those. There's so many things that you don't even think about when you're going to open a food facility that you just don't deal with on a day-to-day basis. It's important to be very well versed with what's required. Do we have any questions before I move on, as far as it needs to be answered?
Carl, I wonder if you might come off mute. It sounds like you have a particular scenario in mind that maybe Ahmed could shed some light on.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Yes.
Technology is wonderful. I'm Carl Frost, Kai Kai Farm. Hello, everybody. So I just would like to highlight a couple things that are very important for rural property owners who are not served by public utilities. The stuff that Ahmed mentioned, it's child's play compared to building a public water supply and a septic system. Those are huge hurdles to get over. And, I just think that's really important that, for future presentations, since a lot of this is addressed to farmers in general. I mean, farmers markets, right? These are rural. Anybody in a rural location is going to have a food service facility has to have a public water supply. There's no way around it. And a septic system. So, and that septic system can't be your house. It's got to be a commercial system with a grease trap. So that means engineers are involved. Big money. So anyway, just wanted to comment about that.
No, thank you. That's a great point to bring up. Our facility is on municipal water and with the grease trap and everything, but you're absolutely right. And even, in non-rural areas, I've seen issues where someone takes over an existing facility and let's say their grease trap or their, septic is leaking and there's issues in plumbing. Probably of all of these things on this list, old plumbing or plumbing that needs to be replaced or doesn't meet up to standards is probably some of the most expensive and challenging things to fix, whether it's an existing facility that you're taking over, or like you said, in a rural area, getting that installed. I'm just curious, is that something that you are currently going through? Have you gone through? Is there any tips you can kind of give to everyone as far as how to get through that process? That's something you're right, I'm not familiar with, so I'm definitely intrigued and interested.
Well, yeah, we're well into it now, and you have to have an engineer. You can't do it yourself. No way. Florida Department of Environmental Protection won't even talk to you hardly. The septic system, you may be able to get around that without an engineer. But the public water supply, you can go through Florida Rural Water. They have engineering staff that's pretty reasonably priced. So the process takes quite a long time. I would plan on it a year. Now, the other problem, of course, is who's going to operate the public water supply on your farm. I went ahead and took a 4-day course and then took the Class D exam for FDEP. So I'm now a licensed public water supply operator. So that's another hurdle. Otherwise you're going to have to hire somebody to come in and do water tests all the time, because you have to have chlorine samples and water samples taken constantly. So yeah, it gets complicated when you deal with water. I think those are the two main things really is, getting an engineer and then considering who's going to operate your water system once it's up and running.
Carl, it sounds like we might need to have you for your own presentation on how to get this started. Sounds like you've jumped through all the hoops and we could learn a lot from that. So thank you for raising all of those points.
Well, we still haven't gotten our license yet for the food service facility. We're just putting in the septic systems shortly. We got all the bids in. Now we're going to award the contract. The public water supply permitting has been done. So that's just a matter now of just installing the equipment. But the big question for us really, and I think it deserves more conversation, is whether we're going to go with DBPR or FDACS as our licensing agency. After all, we are a market here. So, we're going to do value-added food products, and we're also going to be selling dinners. So both agencies have been out here over the years, and they don't really have a roadmap to manage operation like a farm that's licensed. Very few farms in Florida actually are licensed food service facilities. They're probably counted on a couple hands. So the problem is that the regulators, they don't really know what to do with you. So that'll be an interesting episode to go through, finding out who we're gonna dance with. I don't think you can have both. I think you just want one or the other. That's closing.
So Carl, there's actually here in Naples in Southwest Florida, up in Fort Myers, there's actually a farm that I believe has both. I've been there and I met the owners, and I'll have to look through my notes. I think I can get their information, but they actually operate 3 different things. They have a brewery on site, they have food production, and then they have farming. So they might, if I can get their information, I definitely want to get them in touch with you, or maybe, see if you guys can collaborate, you can pick their brain a little bit. But you can get multiple licenses, because the facility I'm at, we have both FDACS and DBPR, companies. Even one of our members has both, has a catering license where she does catered food. And then she also has an FDACS license where she does hot sauces and packaged food. So it is possible. It took her a while to navigate through all of that as well. But I think that's something I could help you with once you get ready to start crossing that bridge to licensing.
Yeah, it's really interesting you comment about the value-added production. However, if you just went with DBPR, for example, I mean, it doesn't really preclude you from doing value-added food products, does it? It
doesn't, but what you wouldn't be able to do anything that's acidified, that's shelf stable. So you'd kind of be stuck with doing, like refrigerated packaged food that has a shelf life under 7 days. That's kind of where the cutoff, as far as I understand it, is. Once you go beyond 7 days, or once you want to do something that's shelf stable, where you need to have an exact pH, or certain kill steps and things like that. Once you start getting into that, then you'll end up with needing an FDACS permit.
Great comment. I appreciate that. Good distinction.
Absolutely.
Well, all right. Well, thanks, y'all. And Ahmed, that's all we have in the chat. So thanks for taking that question, and we can continue on.
Absolutely. No, Carl, that was great conversation. Thank you. So moving on next from construction standards, we kind of already talked about the sewage and waste disposal. The only thing I didn't talk about is hoods and the ventilation, making sure that you have a certified company to come and do your hoods, because then you start to get into things as far as fire prevention and control, having your install system or your fire suppression system that's properly installed, and then you have to get it checked, if not semi-annually, but also annually. You also have to get your hoods commercially cleaned, depending on your volume, whether it's every 3 months. Sometimes I've been in restaurants where it's every month. At least every 3 to 6 months, your hoods have to be professionally cleaned. So there's all of these different steps that you need to have contacts and vendors that are going to do it, because you can't do it yourself. Kind of like Carl mentioned about the water and the sewage and getting that set up. There's so many steps that, you know, unless you own a business that does these things, that you're going to have vendors that you trust, that are accredited, that, you know, are bonded and licensed and all these things, because there's all of these steps have to be done in a professional way, and you're not going to pass your inspection unless it's done, you know, correctly. So you'll save yourself a lot of headache up front just getting it done the right way, and not trying to cut corners. So food regulations. This is something that applies to any food business outside of cottage food, which I know there's a talk about it tomorrow, and I'll touch on a little bit at the end of my presentation. But the FDA food code, that is what Florida and DBPR specifically operate from, is the food code. As I said earlier, it's 700 pages long. It goes down to the details. And if you really have some time to do some reading and you want to kill a couple hours, just Google the food code, the US food code, and it's all available online for you to read through. And when a inspector comes into your food facility, if they do cite you for a violation, they're citing you for something specific in the food code, whether it's, you know, something's out of temperature, or, you know, that your lighting is too low, or that, you know, you have cracks in your baseboards where pests can get it. It's all listed in detail through the food code, and it's constantly changing as we go through and we get more information scientifically, as the food world changes. You know, like recently you have, you know, this big fad on fermentation and kombucha and these different things that are being out there. So as the food market evolves, so will the food regulations. They have to keep up with these new different practices and new things that are being done. The CGMPs, the current good manufacturing practices, that falls under FDAX, and FDAX is the one that'll be implementing a lot of those. So as you can see, the keyword manufacturing, it's mainly for food manufacturing, and it has to do with sanitation practices, proper handling, and proper food container and storage. And it breaks down that's also something you can look up. If you Google 21 CFR 117 and just read through that, that'll kind of give you a good understanding of some of the information that's in there. Acidified and low acid canned foods. Anyone, and I know probably there's some farmers out there that are looking into canning their crops, because you know, you get a big surplus of crops. What do you do with it if you can't sell it all? Look at in canning. Looking at the acidified or low acid canned food regulations kind of help give you an understanding on how that's going to go, and how those regulations are implemented and kind of upheld. And if you're going to get into that, I will say you're definitely going to want to do some reading on these, because there are very specific thresholds for acidity, for temperature. If you're canning food, anyone that's ever canned food and has a pressure canner, doing it at home is scary enough. Doing it on a commercial scale is, you're going to want to be very well versed in those processes. Hazard analysis and critical control point, HACCP. Hopefully you've heard of HACCP. If you haven't, look this up. UF does, and I know some other agencies do classes, whether it's juice HACCP, seafood HACCP, general HACCP. It's basically a plan. And as a funny story, it's actually enacted by NASA for astronauts going to space. They didn't want them getting foodborne illness and getting sick in space. You know, throwing up in a spacesuit is, I'm sure, not a fun experience. So, you know, they created these, what's called food safety plans, or HACCP is an acronym for this critical control point, that actually identifies hazards in your food production, whether it's if chicken sits out too long, or if chicken isn't cooked to 165. And all of these hazards you identify, and then you implement a plan to prevent these hazards from causing issues and getting people sick. You'll find that a lot of running a commercial kitchen is about mitigating hazards, getting people sick, you know, whether it's chemicals, whether it's time and temperature of use, you know, all of these different things. You spend a majority of your time, more probably, or just as much time that you're doing recipe, reviewing your recipes and recipe kind of testing, you're doing more looking at these safety measures. The Food Safety Modernization Act, which was signed into law 2011, was basically an updating on a lot of the things that before didn't fall into like juice HACCP or seafood HACCP or general HACCP. There was a lot of food products that were kind of falling in between those. Even though you could use a HACCP plan to kind of help, produce those, Food Safety Modernization Act was just an updating. It has a total of 7 rules, which preventive controls for human foods is the specific one if you're doing commercial kitchen that you're going to want to look at and understand. And these rules, it seems like a lot, and it is a lot to digest. I just suggest take whichever one is closest to the food product that you're going to do. And generally, this is going to fall for more of the food production under FDACs. A lot of the HACCP plans and the acidified food, in general, good manufacturing practices, those fall under FDACs. The food code, you can learn a lot from that with ServSafe Manager, and in those courses. That'll kind of help you with understanding the food code side. For these other ones, there are specific training classes you can take. If you look around online, I know a lot of them have been kind of put on pause because of COVID, unfortunately, but once things start getting back to normal, or maybe they'll start doing virtually, just start kind of keeping an eye out and looking for different classes that'll help you kind of understand and get a grasp on these things. So I know that's a lot of information. Were there any specific questions on that before I move on? This is a very important section. And we could probably do one presentation just on food regulations and take up 45 minutes. But if you do have more questions, reach out to me. And if I don't know, I know someone that knows that'll be able to help.
Yeah, Ahmed, we have a question in the chat.
Yes.
Larry asks, in general, is Florida a much friendlier and easier state to set up farms and food service businesses than other states like New York and California?
So I don't have much experience setting up or how it's set up outside Florida. I can tell you my experience with Florida. It's been the only part that's hard is figuring out which agency you're going to fall under. As Carl was mentioning earlier, whether you're going to be DVPR or FDACs. And I've heard stories of people being, going to FDACs, going through the whole process and getting date of inspection. And it's decided, oh, you're going to end up under DVPR because of a certain food you're going to do. So I'd say that's the probably more difficult part. But once you actually start working with the regulators, you meet your local regulator and inspector who's going to come out. They've been pretty helpful. I'd say more so than the actual state regulators. Maybe I've heard a lot of issues locally, maybe with zoning and dealing with that aspect of it has been, a little bit more difficult to get through. But as far as the state regulators, once you get the ball rolling and you meet your local inspector, it's been pretty straightforward. Yeah. Does anyone else have anything to add as far as the farming aspect? Okay.
It's Carl.
Yes.
Yeah, I'd just like to point out that the Florida agritourism statute now has really enabled farms to conduct commercial activities where they now you can literally just smile at your local building department or code inspector says you can't do this or that because those days are gone, where the county basically can say, no, you can't do commercial activities. Agritourism law now allows you to do things like sell food items and stuff like that. Even open a restaurant. They may give you a hard time, but you've got a lot more authority now than we did, say, 10 years ago. Just keep that in mind. That Florida agritourism statute's a very powerful tool for farms to conduct commercial activities.
Awesome. Thank you, Carl. That's very useful. So which regulation applies to me? I've hinted on this a couple times for the other slide because this is paramount to getting and launching your commercial kitchen. The type of food, how is it going to be sold, who's it sold to, all of these questions. Just one different answer on one of these questions can completely change whether you're going to be regulated by one agency or another. For example, this is something that I dealt with personally in our facility. I had a gentleman who wanted to start his own line of bacon. He cured it. He had this all natural without, sulfates or anything, cure that he used. And he smoked it himself and he did everything. He had all the packaging, everything ready to go. And if he were to sell that direct to consumer, which is retail, if I was just selling directly to the end user, he would have been able to do it. But he wanted to sell it to restaurants and grocery stores, which is wholesale. And that would fall under USDA, and USDA does not give permits in shared commercial kitchens or shared spaces. So that one difference between selling retail and selling wholesale can completely change, you know, whether you're going to need a food safety plan and HACCP and things I was talking about. And, you know, also your sales, how much you're planning to sell once you get started or what your projections are. Can, as I mentioned earlier, there's about, I think it changes depending on which regulation you're talking about, but in generally around a $1 million threshold of gross annual revenue. Once you start getting above that, you're going to fall into a little bit more stringent regulations. Now with USDA, it doesn't matter if you're doing wholesale production. It doesn't matter if you're doing 10,000 a year or, you know, 100,000 a year. You're going to be inspected pretty much the same, unless you have facilities in other states, and it gets a little bit bigger. But a USDA inspector is going to be on site while you're doing production. So USDA is a pretty big task to get going. You know, what's the shelf life of the product? Just like, you know, in speaking with Carl earlier, if you're talking about having a shelf life of a product being over 7 days, or if it's going to be, you know, shelf stable, you're going to fall under a specific regulation if you're going to do more than that. If it's under that, then most things you can do under a DBPR catering license, restaurant license, you know, food truck, you know, or food trailer. It's a lot different when you're talking about having a limited shelf life. Reason being is once you start getting over 7 days, there's a lot more of a potential for certain foodborne illness. We talk about botulism, you know, and you know, if it's not the proper acidity or if it didn't reach the right temperature and canning process, then you could potentially give people botulism, which is very deadly. And it's something that everyone fears if you do any canning or hot sauce production. So that's the reason being. So if you're going to do over that, you need, you know, process authority letters, or you need testing and scientific data backing up that your scientific recipe is going to be safe for a certain amount of time on the shelf. You know, how much, I've already touched on how much, and the monetary sales, they can put you in a different category as far as how you're going to be inspected and what's going to be required of you. You know, at these large facilities, they actually hire positions that are just food safety positions, guys that are just overlooking your food safety plan, updating it. Because another thing I want to touch on, which I should have mentioned earlier, but with HACCP plans and food safety plans, they aren't something you just write and put it on a shelf and it's just there. It's something that's constantly updating as you're identifying new hazards, as you're changing your recipes, as you know, if you're changing employees and different things, if your facility changes. So in some of these large scale production facilities, they have 1, 2, if not multiple positions of people that are solely there to monitor the food safety side of things. So that way the owners and the people that actually do the production are just focused on, you know, making sure the food's good. And then they have the food safety individuals that help, you know, with making sure no one gets sick. And then what are your plans for future growth? You know, a lot of times in our facility, I always tell people start small. Don't try to go too big too early, because that can kind of suffocate you and kind of, you know, have a failure launch before you even get going. So just ask yourself these questions, know the answers to them. The inspectors are going to probably ask you most of these questions. So it's important for you to think these out before you even, you know, get started with your applying for your food permit.
Ahmed, I just want to lift up a quick question in the chat. It looks like it's about a specific product. It's about dry herb sales.
Okay, so dried herb sales, you know, spices are included under cottage food. So that would be something that potentially could be done under cottage food, I believe, but we'd have to double check. So if they're taking a fresh herb that they're growing or that they're buying and they're drying it themselves, it does check the box of not needing refrigeration. It does check the box of being potentially a herb or spice. So I believe that could be done that way. And I have a slide later, which will talk about a little bit of the cottage food. And I would definitely suggest looking up the actual cottage food exemption. There's some confusion like that because some people think that it's actually a cottage food regulation. It's not. It's an exemption from being regulated and being allowed to do it from your home. Now, if he's talking about doing it from a commercial kitchen, then that would fall under FDAX. That would be an FDAX production if he wants to wholesale it and do some large scale production. Because cottage food does limit you to, I believe it's 50,000 annual in sales. So there's a couple things that can bump you out of that exemption. Whether, you know, if you're not going to do it from home, if you're doing under cottage from a commercial space, it won't be cottage. You have to get a permit and it'll be FDAX. If you have a certain amount of sales, you have to get a permit and it'll be FDAX most likely.
Great, thanks. And we will have a presentation tomorrow entirely about Cottage Food Lot. So please tune in tomorrow if that maybe will answer your question. Thanks, Ahmed.
Yep. So DBPR regulated facilities, I've already touched on this a little bit, but permanent food facilities, whether it's restaurant, takeout, cafes, cafes with a little asterisk, because if you do, more, drinks and baked goods, and you might be under FDAX. Catering, your mobile caterers that go out and, whether it's catering an event, catering someone's home, that'll be DBPR regulated. Mobile food dispensing units, your food trucks, your trailers, your hot dog carts, certain vending machines. Vending machines can fall under both FDAX and DBPR, depending on what's in them. And temporary food service events like fairs, carnivals, festivals. And I know Lisa's already, talked about a lot of this, but that's where kind of DBPR, what will fall under DBPR. FDAX. So with FDAX, you want to think kind of more manufactured foods, your bottled sauces, your canned foods, seafood processes, your bottled juices, anything where you're thinking bottled, jarred, shelf stable, extended life, more than likely you're going to fall under FDAX. Your retail food establishment, grocery stores, your bakeries, coffee shops, retail meat and food, seafood markets, convenience stores, farmers markets. So that'll fall under the FDAX. Limited poultry. So generally poultry is going to be USDA, but there is a limited poultry and egg farm. If you have under 1,000 laying hens and or under 20,000 poultry that you process annually, you'll be able to be licensed by FDAX. So you don't have to go through the USDA. It's kind of just to get poultry farmers, a way to get started and grow. And then once you reach those limits, then you'll end up being under USDA. And then ice vending machines and water machines, animal food production, those will all fall under FDAX. FDA programs and services. So the FDA is more of a federal level, which oversees our local state agencies. Food facility registration. This is something you have to do if you're going to do a hot sauce or any kind of manufacturing food. Even though you're going to be licensed and inspected by the Florida FDAX, that agency, you still have to register your facility at the federal level with FDA. And there's links and information on the website how to do that. And then you also have to file your process, which is you'll get that from your the company that you send off to get your food tested for your process authority letter. They're the ones that basically, just to put it simply, they give you a scientific recipe that it has to be heated to this, it has to come out this pH, it has to be bottled a certain way. You send your product to them and how you're going to make it. They send you back the testing with the results, with the pH level, and they give you a scientific recipe that you have to then file with the FDA. Shell and egg producer registration as well. Export listing module, that's if you're doing import and export. And the FDA has other things that kind of, depending on what kind of food you're going to do, that you have to register or get information on with them. So that goes back to my slide where I was saying, ask yourself these questions, because depending on what you're doing, you're not only going to have to file with FDAX in Florida, you also have to file certain things with FDA and federal level too, which your inspector will be able to help you with if you're going to need to do these things, and because they're going to ask you for a lot of this information. So kind of going back, and I'm being repetitive, but as soon as you get that call from whether it's FDAX or DBPR, your inspector, get their number, get their email, because I guarantee you're going to have more questions about what's required of you and what you don't have to do in the beginning. The USDA programs and services, they do organic certifications, Perishable Agriculture Commodities Act, the wholesale meat, poultry, and egg facilities. So anything that's wholesale with meat, egg, and poultry, you're going to have a USDA inspection and permit. And something about the USDA, they have to have an inspector on site at all times when you're doing production. So if you're doing production 24/7, you're going to have an inspector in your building 24/7. Slaughterhouses, certain farms and ranches are through the Farm Service Agency in Florida. But mainly, like I said, if you're doing any large scale meat, that's really what we deal with when we have members come in. If they're doing any wholesale meat or production, in a commercial kitchen setting, we can't facilitate that. Cottage food, I've just listed this just to kind of go over it briefly. We have a whole presentation tomorrow, as Rachel said a little bit earlier. It's a Florida law allows individuals to use and it's an exemption from the law that allows individuals to use their unlicensed home kitchens to produce for sale certain foods that present a low risk for foodborne illness. You know, so examples: loaf breads, cakes, pastries, cookies, honeys, jams, dried herbs, as we were talking. All these you can get started at a very low level, up to and not exceeding $50,000 in annual sales. So it's a good way to get started. And we actually have a lot of success stories in our kitchen that started as cottage food and then came to the commercial kitchen to get their food permit and to grow, and then went out and opened their own facility. So shared use kitchens, this is kind of my specialty. This is really what I'm an expert in. The commissary, accelerator, incubator, commercial kitchen model, something that's really growing, becoming really popular across the country. The actual kitchen itself, our facility, we're licensed by DBPR. But in the facility, we have both DBPR and FDAS licenses. And each company that comes in has to get their own license, even though us as the facility operators have the license for the facility that it's been inspected. Each member has to get their own license. So every time a new member comes, they go through this entire process that I've been explaining each and every time. So it's something you kind of become pretty good at after doing it a few times. But I will say each time is its own different experience. Even small nuanced changes or differences between people's food can completely change the route or the process to get their license. Permits are renewed annually, and it's up to the members to renew and keep up to date their permits. They do each get their own inspection by whether DBPR or FDAX annually. So, and sometimes semi-annually, depending on what kind of food they're doing. We provide, so as a kitchen space, we provide the kitchen, we provide everything's already met construction standards. We have walk-in refrigerator space. So we provide a template, kind of like a foundation for someone to come in. They don't have to worry about going through the entire process. They don't have to go through plan review and all that. They just really have to file for all their permits, make sure they have their food safety training, and then they can come in and use our kitchen to launch their food business. And something that is kind of an intangible, it's kind of like you're not able to measure it, but it provides an environment where like-minded individuals, upstart entrepreneurs, they just come together and collaborate. We've had a number of members that work together creating new products that help each other with contacts for, you know, whether it's for packaging or whether it's for marketing or whatever it is. It seems like just organically and naturally people tend to work together and help each other out. So that's something that's been kind of like a positive kind of byproduct of the shared commercial kitchen. Here's a list of commercial kitchens over the state. This isn't a comprehensive list. This is the ones that I know of or that we've seen or affiliate with. I'm at the Culinary Accelerator, which is the third one from the bottom. We are a county facility, so we're run, operated, and owned by Collier County. Some of these are private. Some may be affiliated with local educators or, you know, colleges and universities, and some are government. So it just, and none of them are different or better than others. It's just the way that they get started and the way they're structured. But I think they're an important part of these communities. And I think if you were to talk to anyone that operates in these facilities, there are impacts being made, positive impacts being made by facilities like this, not just in Florida, but, you know, all over the country. So, and like I said, these slides will be available for to send out via email. And in summary, like I said, ask those simple questions of yourself, of the regulator, others that have gone through it. If you have any friends that have a restaurant or have a food truck, pick their brain, learn from their pitfalls and the mistakes that they went through in getting licensed. Know the type of food, the sales, know your business inside and out, you know, from every small little detail. Don't think any detail's too small. Don't overlook it. You know, write it down, have it in your business plan, your marketing plan. Get to know your agency inspectors, as I mentioned. Once they reach out to you, you know, get a hold of that information, at least an email, so you can go back and forth. Because a lot of times they are busy and it's hard to get them on the phone. But definitely get their emails. Create and maintain a detailed business plan. Update it as you're going along. And seek advice from mentorship programs such as SBDC or SCORE. Look in your local area with your economic development, whether in your county or, you know, on a state level, to see what resources are available to you. A lot of them are free. SCORE is a society of retired executives that offer free mentorship from people that were CEOs of, you know, whether it was a food company or whatever it may be. reach out to these local resources to help you along your way. So that's my presentation today. If there's any other questions or anything, please feel free to ask.
Yeah, thank you so much, Ahmed.
Yes,
We have
pleasure.
probably time for one question. Larry, I do see your questions in the chat, and it is my understanding that sales over $50,000 a year do not qualify for Cottage Food Law. That $50,000 a year is the cap for cottage food. And then has the agritourism law changed since 2016? I don't think that's Ahmed's arena, but it sounds like Carl has a lot of information about how to use that agritourism law. So maybe Carl, you could add some thoughts in the chat. And yeah, if there's anybody who wants to come off mute, we have time for one more question for Ahmed. Or if you want to put a question in the chat, we can take it there as well. All right, well, thanks so much. And